Out. I know the weather has not been very good, but yet we have a warm day today. But thanks for coming here and being part of this. This is a continuation of our Theology Matters and talking about a very important issue tonight, and that's the dignity of human labor. It's something that all of us participate in throughout our lives, and it's an important part and take up quite a bit of our life. I was listening to the radio the other day, and there's a comedian on talking about how he loves what he's doing because he couldn't imagine having a real job. He said they expect you to be there 8 hours. He said that's a third of your life. He said if I'm doing the math right, I think I'm doing it right. But that is a large part of our life. And not only what we do that we are paid for, but the labor that we do also, the volunteer work that we do, the other things that we do in outreach. It's all part of that labor, and all of that has great dignity and based in our scriptures. And looking forward to hearing the presentation this evening. As I mentioned in the announcements, and tomorrow is the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. And May 1st is many times dedicated to laborers. And we have a prayer and adaptation here for St. Joseph the Worker, and I invite you to pray with me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Help us to respect the dignity of all workers, all who labor to support their families and the community. Help us to learn about and to care about workers who do not have fair wages, just benefits, or safe working environments. Help us to ask our government and our representatives to develop policies that create safe jobs with wages offering dignity. You taught your son the value of work and the joy of work well done. Teach us these lessons, the value of work, our sharing in the creation of our world, and the joy of work well done. Guide us in our work and in the work of justice we are all called to participate in. Renew our strength and commit each day as we face the work ahead and as we labor for the common good for all. We ask this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cindy Sauer, and I am a co-chair of the Catholic Social Teaching team. And Catholic Social Teaching and the Faith Formation Group of the parish sponsor holding these events, and the Theology Department at Creighton, the Emil Graf Chair, sponsors our speakers for us. So we want to thank Todd and his work with that, and generosity, and Creighton, first of all. As Father said, tonight we're going to talk about the dignity of work and justice for workers. And Dr. Dan DiLeo from Creighton University is our presenter tonight. And he will focus on the Church's teaching that work is a way we continue to participate in God's creation, and the importance of having just conditions and safe conditions and just pay. Dan is an assistant professor at Creighton and the director of the Justice and Peace Studies program. And for the past 9 years, he has also served as a consultant to the Catholic Climate Covenant. He earned his PhD in theological ethics from Boston College and specialized in Catholic social teaching and climate change. And if that's not enough, he has a 5-week-old baby as well. So we welcome you, and thank you so much.
Is this loud enough? People hear me? Okay. I told Todd beforehand, I'm wary of lavaliers because I once had a priest walk into the bathroom while his was on. So I'm always very, very wary of turning on the lavalier too early. So thank you, though, for having me. I really, really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here. As long as I can get my slides. Good?
Yep.
Okay. As was mentioned, my name is Dan DiLeo. I direct the Justice and Peace Studies program. I specialize in Catholic social teaching, of which the dignity of work and the rights of workers are an integral part, and we'll talk a whole lot about that tonight. By training and really by disposition, I'm an applied ethicist. So my inclination is to jump right into the nitty-gritty, to get my hands dirty, to start assessing policies. But as I've done this work more and more, I've really come to appreciate the need to situate the church's social tradition within the broader context. Within the broader context of what I'll call theological anthropology, or a particular vision of what it means to be human, and even more broadly in the Christian vocation to live the gospel. So if you'll bear with me for the first few minutes here, what I want to do is sketch out the way that the church understands what it means to be human. I think if we can plod through this, we'll have a much more solid foundation upon which to have a much more robust conversation about the dignity of work and the rights of workers later on. So does that sound good? Should that work? Okay. And if not, too bad, because that's what I prepared. So, on not a whole lot of sleep for the 5-week-old, which is why I got to drink coffee. So, I think what I'll do is start at the beginning and start with God. Seems like a pretty good place to start as a theologian. There's a theologian at Boston College named Michael Himes. Actually, his brother Ken is also at BC. The two of them are a fairly dynamic duo. Michael does systematics, Ken does ethics, and Ken was my dissertation director, so I have a particular affinity for the Himes brothers. And Michael has a book called Doing the Truth in Love. It's a very thin book, but there's a lot in here, and I think it's an especially helpful place from which we can begin this conversation of what it means to be human in the Catholic Christian sense. So Michael begins the conversation and he says, God is absolute mystery. Whatever else we say about God, God is mystery. We can never fully understand God. The statement that God is mystery doesn't encapsulate the nature of the fact that God is mystery. God is always deeper. That doesn't mean, though, that we can't say anything about God. Michael has this great little line. He says, the least inadequate expression for God is to say that God is love. I love that. The least inadequate expression for talking about God. Now, in the Greek, there are several different ways of talking about love. And the Greek that is used to talk about God is love as agape. Have folks heard this phrase, this term, agapic love, before? Okay. So there are a lot of different ways that we can talk about agapic love, but I think Michael gives us a good starting point definition. He talks about agapic love as love which is purely other-directed, love which seeks no return, love which does not want anything back. He calls agapic love pure self-gift. This is the love of God. This is the love with which God loves. God does love, but we can say more about God. God is love, is the claim in Scripture. That's a different claim than saying God loves. Of course, God loves, but God is love. And based on this claim, we can begin to intuit some characteristics of God and in turn about ourselves. By saying that God is love, we're making the claim that God is relational. Because love entails self-gift to another person who by definition has to be willing to receive that gift. And so if God is love, it would be a non sequitur to say that God is anything but relational. So that may sound a little bit abstract, it may sound a little heady, but when you stop and think about it, this is the dogma of the Trinity, right? This is what we say when we proclaim one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. God is inherently, intrinsically relational. Of course, this was St. Patrick's insight with the three-leaf clover, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And as I've said to Rich Miller, I'm not sure what to do with a four-leaf clover. I think that's theology that was lost in Alexandria with the destruction of the library. So, but for our purposes, God is Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Or as Augustine said, lover, beloved, and the love between, if that's a more helpful vision. Somehow there's this dynamism within the very person of God. God is relational. God is love. And so what Michael says, in summary, is what is meant by the word God is an eternal outpouring of self, a continual giving, which is accepted and returned in continual giving. God is love. Okay? So you can say, well, that's wonderful. I'm here on a Monday evening here listening to the fact that God is love. What does this have to do with dignity, work, vision of the human person? I think it lays the groundwork from which we can begin to intuit some things about what it means to be human. And I say that because we are made in the image and likeness of God. Then God said, let us, notice the plural. Before anything else was ever created, God is already speaking about God's self in the plural. Let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. So in order to know something about what it means to be human, we've got to know something about nature and the person of God. So based on this very short claim, we can begin to intuit and unpack a whole lot more about what it means to be human. And I'm just going to run through a few different of these dimensions because I think these will be kind of the ethical coordinates, as Ken Himes likes to call them, by which we navigate this process of talking about human work and the dignity of work and rights of workers. So the first is that we can say that people are sacred. We are created in the image and likeness of God. We have an indelible stamp of the divine by virtue of our very being. There's an innate dignity, and from this dignity, then, the church goes on to talk about rights, inviolable rights by which that dignity is protected and promoted. And we'll talk about right to work and right to a just wage as parts of those inviolable rights. But this is all rooted in dignity, which comes from the imago Dei, the fact that we are created in God's image. We are sacred, but we are also social by virtue of the fact that God is social. And what this means for ethics, as we begin to kind of peel back the layers of the onion, is that we can only realize dignity in community. We can't ever realize dignity in complete isolation from one another. We are inherently social beings. This is not necessarily unique to the Christian tradition. This was Aristotle's insight that people are social, political animals. So this is not a Christian insight necessarily, but it does underpin this notion that dignity can only be realized in community. The corollary from that is that rights always entail responsibilities. We'll unpack that a whole lot more, but that's one of the foundational claims of Catholic social teaching, is that rights and responsibilities are always correlational. The third is that people are creaturely. We are creatures. We are part of creation, so Genesis 2:7, God breathed life into us from the dust of the earth. We are creatures. We are organic beings. The ethical implications of this, and this is really my area of expertise, is climate change, is that what happens to the natural world happens to us. We are part of the natural world, such that environmental degradation compromises human life, human dignity. It undermines the preferential option for the poor. So we are creatures. We are not somehow radically removed from all of creation. We are called to cultivate and care for creation. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes. But part of our dignity comes from the fact that God invites us to be co-creators, co-laborers, co-workers with God. That's a radical claim. We are not just part of nature being operated on by laws and principles. We have agency. We have self-determination. That's part of what sets us apart and gives us dignity as created in the image and likeness of God. And fourth, we are agapic. We are created by love, for love, to love. So these are really the principles by which we begin to map out a vision of what it means to be human and against which we can situate a conversation about work. So this business of love, by love, for love, to love. I want to spend just a few minutes on this. You all are here as people from the Justice and Peace program committee here, so you understand, hopefully, the connection between loving God and loving neighbor, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and beginning from a common foundation. So I want to spend a few minutes unpacking this. So Ken Himes, Michael's brother, talks about the moral life as call and response. We are called and loved by God, and we are invited to respond in love. Or as when John says, we love because God first loved us. God's initiative begins the dynamic. We are called to respond in love. And so this underpins, again, I keep using that word in this first part because I think we're really underpinning the conversation. this is what we're called to vis-a-vis the God who first loves us. We are called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. This is Jesus speaking in Matthew's gospel. So we're called to love God. And the second commandment, though, is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Why is that? It goes back to this notion of the imago Dei. We are created in the image and likeness of God, such that we can't love God without loving what God loves and in whom God is present, namely other people. And so then I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least of brothers of mine, you did for me. Jesus' famous Matthew 25. Jesus is in the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized. This is where God is. And so this is the commandment we have from God. Whoever loves God must also love his brother. The commandment about which he's speaking is, I give you a new command, love one another. As I have loved you, so you should love one another. So all the things that we're going to be talking about over the course of the evening, I think, are really rooted in this understanding that God is love and that we are called to love in response. Again, wonderful, systematic, dogmatic theology, catechesis, RCIA, interesting. What does that have to do for our purposes? Well, towards the end of the book, this Doing the Truth in Love, Michael asks this probing question. He says, but how to give oneself away? How to love? How ought we to respond to the invitation to love God and therefore to love our neighbor? You can think about Catholic social teaching in a lot of different ways, but to me, one of the most rich ways to think about Catholic social teaching is that it is a response, it is the Church's collective response to try and answer this question. How do we love? Or how should we love? How should we give ourselves away? Once you understand that, then I think you've got a much more rich backdrop against which to begin to talk about specific principles and make assessments about a policy or this policy or another proposal. All of this is a response to the question, how do we love? In response to the fact that God loved us first. So I know, having taught for a while, not a whole long time, but a while, that I can only talk so long before people's eyes glaze over and people check out. So, at this point, I want to hear what you think. Is this new for anybody? Raise your hand if this is old hat. If this is more or less, you've heard this all before. This is a common way of understanding Catholic social teaching. Okay, that's actually a fairly high percentage for relative to other talks I did, so that's good. For those for whom this is new, what's your reaction to this? How are you wrestling with this? What do you like about this vision? What makes you uncomfortable? What questions do you have? There's a lot here, but it's important that I want to spend a few minutes unpacking it. People are sacred, social, creaturely, and agapic. Yes?
Well, this is not totally new to me, but I think that last question is the key, and it's the one that I stress over all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So how? How do you love, and just how much of yourself can you give away, and what's appropriate?
Right.
All of that is just really, it can be stressful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a 5-year-old. It can definitely be stressful. What about others? How does this strike you? I mean, these are fairly countercultural claims. Dignity can only be realized in community. Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me as a nurse and having practiced in community health as well as education is that does underpin what you do when you work in community health, particularly if you're working in public health and in public health settings.
Right.
Because you are working with the more marginal, you are working with people. And even this week I helped with a refugee family and I felt like I don't know what to do. I know I need to be present and do something, but I wasn't sure what I should do. So I think I hear what you are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very countercultural and prophetic, right? Especially in our culture that's very individualist, and we hear things about, well, I built this, or this idea that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that type of thing, that's really antithetical to this anthropology and the idea of community, that we're all in this together, and the idea of the common good, we don't hear that in our language.
We'll talk about the common good in a few minutes. That's we'll talk a lot about that. But yeah, I mean, it's let me ask you a question. If I could be so bold and to ask you to be vulnerable, if you're willing to. Does this make anybody uncomfortable because it's so countercultural? Is it? You uncomfortable with this? Do you push back against these notions? I mean, I've given a lot of parish talks. I've been called a lot of things. So you're not going to hurt my feelings. You're not going to hurt my feelings. What do you think? I mean, as you grapple with this, as you try and make sense of this, is this uncomfortable for anybody?
I mean, I would just say, I mean, I was Jesuit educated, and I've done a lot of reading, in my adulthood, and really the message about Christ was he was countercultural. And if I'm really trying to live like Christ, then I need to be countercultural also, because so much of what I do value is countercultural. And I guess I'm at the point where I'm not uncomfortable with that. The challenge, though, is really living that out.
Yeah, so becoming comfortable being uncomfortable. Okay. That resonates with me. Any other thoughts before we proceed? Yeah.
A new thought to me was that God said, let us make human in our image. Trying not to use all male terms for God, I just said God made human being in God's image. But the us part of it is expanded. And I like it.
Yep.
Trained as a sociologist.
Yep. Okay. So that was my undergrad. You know this. Yep.
So that that clicked in, and I like that.
Yeah. And I think even in a sense, when we talk about how all this fits together, that I would argue is actually one of the most radical claims, because that's the claim upon which we proceed to say dignity can only be realized in community. That we can affirm dignity, but not as radical individuals who can somehow hold themselves up by their bootstraps. That we are all, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, how John Paul talks about solidarity, we are all really responsible for all by virtue of the fact that we are social, because God is social. It's just a different way of seeing the world, at least to me, as I've encountered and unpacked a lot of this material. Okay, so we have said that people are sacred and social creatures made by love, for love, to love. I would say God, others, and creation. We can talk more about the creation part if you want, but I'll just throw that in for the sake of yeah. I'll take the option. And so we've got this question about how to give oneself away. And I've made the claim that Catholic social teaching is really the Church's collective unpacking of how to answer this question. How do we love? How do we give ourselves away? Well, what is Catholic social teaching? What do I mean by that when I say that? As my students will tell you, I'm very big into defining terms, because we can use one term and have very different meanings, so I will define my terms up front. By Catholic social teaching, I mean the body of key magisterial documents that together propose principles for reflection, provide criteria for judgment, and give guidelines for action. As just an academic quibbling, this I think is distinct from Catholic social thought, which is what Todd does and what I do as people whose profession it is to think critically about this, to try and ask questions, to probe it, but as people who don't wear tall hats as bishops and have the authority to write magisterial documents. So when I mean Catholic social teaching, I mean the official magisterial documents of the Church. So on your table, you have the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. The Church's tradition, the Church's social tradition has, as I'm sure you're well aware, has developed over the last 125, 30, 40 years beginning with Leo XIII's encyclical in 1891, Rerum Novarum. So ever since then, the church has been and continues to develop its thinking about social issues and social questions. And what the church has tried to do is to boil all of this down into, again, what Ken Himes calls ethical coordinates. What are some of the key principles, the key pillars of this vision of Catholic social teaching? So the bishops outlined 7, and I think they are correct in doing so. So they identify life and dignity of the human person, call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. I have worked with these principles, or these themes, this list of themes. I think it's a very solid foundation. To my mind, I actually prefer a different list, and it's just different ways to unpack all of this. There's a Jesuit, William Byron, who in American Magazine in the 90s proposed 10 building blocks of Catholic social teaching. What I like about Byron's list is that it unpacks and it nuances and it distinguishes some of these principles in ways that I think the 7 themes kind of collapse them together. Does that make sense? I think Byron's is a bit more nuanced. So he talks about human dignity, respect for human life, association, participation, preferential protection or option for the poor and vulnerable, solidarity, stewardship, subsidiarity, human equality, and the common good. So different ways of talking about it, many similar terms, obviously similar, identical primary documents, but just different ways to think about the tradition. Whatever list you use, I think it's important to emphasize that you can, and we're going to do this, you can unpack one of these or a few of these individually. But as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, so this came out under Cardinal Ratzinger prior to his election as Pope Benedict XVI, I think this is a helpful reminder. The Christian faith is an integral unity, and thus it is incoherent to isolate some particular element to the detriment of the whole of Catholic doctrine. In other words, we can talk about one or more principles and we can go into depth, but at the end of the day, we have to remember that each one of these principles is a puzzle piece that fits together with all of the others. And ultimately, whether we're using 7 principles or the 10 building blocks, we have to remember that this is a system. This is a worldview. This is a way of seeing things. And so what happens to one principle inevitably impacts other principles. So as I said, I work on climate change. This is especially true in my work, that environmental degradation undermines human life, human dignity. It disproportionately impacts the poor. It compromises the common good. So all of these principles are integrally related. So I say that as a reminder as we begin to unpack this specific principle on dignity of work and rights of workers. So let me stop again and just take the temperature. Where are folks at? Is this more or less boilerplate, I would assume at this point, but are there any new insights, things that struck you, maybe different connections that you've made, in light of your own experience about Catholic social teaching?
I think a really important point is the integral connection of all of those.
Yep.
And I'm always curious why there's so much fluidity in Catholic social teaching on certain issues, so people can hold for capital punishment and defend that and say, well, it's potential judgment, and still maintain that they're following church teaching. There's a letter in the Public Pulse this morning about that, as a matter of fact. And yet on other areas, like sexual ethics, it's very black and white. So that's always a bit challenging.
Right. And Todd raises a good point, and I thought about putting it in here, but I didn't want to just dump a whole bunch of theology in here. But one of the points that I emphasize to my students is within the tradition of the church, there are gradations of church teaching authority. Todd mentioned a prudential judgment. Categorically, you can think about 3 categories or 3 typologies of church teaching: dogma, doctrine, and prudential judgment. So dogmas are those things that are absolutely central to the faith of the church. So God exists, God is love. Those are dogmatic claims that merit the most reverent response from the faithful. to the point that to deny a dogma would effectively to place oneself outside of the community. So that's the absolute meta level of church teaching. Doctrine are kind of the secondary precepts that are derived from dogmatic claims. And I think you could plausibly make the argument that in many ways what we're talking about here is doctrine. These are the next level down that provide some specificity to the dogmatic claims, but don't really get into the granular. The granular level of church teaching authority is what Todd called prudential judgments. This is where we begin to make prudential judgments and assess particular policies, different legislative proposals, and this is where the bishops can come out and say, yes, we think that this policy upholds human life and human dignity, or no, we don't think this particular policy is consistent with church teaching. So each one of those descending levels of authority merits a corollary level of assent from the faithful. So at no point are people just free to say, to heck with it, I'm just going to completely dismiss it outright. We're always called to prayerfully, considerately reflect on teachings, even prudential judgments, but it is to say that there are different gradations, and so that's just a point of ecclesiology for the sake of mentioning it. Okay, so other thoughts or reflections about Catholic social teaching, things that I said? Yeah.
I think Catholic social teaching is kind of one of the best kept secrets of the Catholic faith. It just kind of amazes me how many of my fellow Catholics this group accepted aren't familiar with all 7 of them at all, but even a few of them. I mean, it's just
do you have a sense of why that is?
I was one of those people not all that long ago, you know.
Do you have a sense of why that might be, based on your experience? I'm not fishing for answers, I'm just based on your experience.
I don't know that it's always reflected from the pulpit. I don't think some of our priests speak to Catholic social teaching, because it can be kind of touchy, maybe, unpopular, I don't know.
Countercultural, prophetic.
Countercultural, right, exactly. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't know. I do not remember learning about Catholic social teaching at my Catholic high school.
Yeah.
Back
And I did not.
way back.
Catechism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We never talked about that.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
memorizing things and
Right.
Right.
So that's something that's always kind of fascinated me.
Yeah.
That it's,
Which is why I've tried to situate Catholic social teaching as I have, because hopefully you can see it as the logical extension of saying that God is love. I mean, this is not some secondary add-on that's optional to what it means to be Christian. This is how we respond to the fact that God is love and calls us to respond to love. This is not an optional afterthought, which is why I'm having my students read a book called Beyond Piety next semester to try and help them begin to connect piety, personal spirituality, and the church's social mission, because the mission flows out of, hopefully, that piety and that personal living. So, but that's neither here nor there. Other thoughts, other reflections, responses, connections? Did you go? Okay. So what I want to do now is begin to unpack these different principles, and what I've decided to do is to ground them in reference to the actual church documents. I learned this a long time ago, that if people think it's just me as an individual standing up here making this stuff up, it's a whole lot easier for them to push back and accuse me of unchristian things, of which I have been accused giving parish talks. So, if you'll forgive me with the quotes and the text, I, if nothing else, just want to give you the resources and show you, hopefully, give you a sense of where all this is in the tradition. So one of the things we talk about is rights and responsibilities in the tradition. And as I said, rights are the ways in which human dignity is codified, the way that it's protected, the way it's promoted. So that's, again, kind of theoretical, abstract. What does that actually mean? What does that mean in the day-to-day nitty-gritty? So I'm not going to read all of this, but this is John Paul II speaking in 1979 to the General Assembly of the United Nations, giving a laundry list of the rights that the church recognizes as fundamental to the protection and promotion of human dignity. These are not rights. I don't think that a lot of people, a lot of Catholics, understand that are affirmed as such by the church. So you can see a lot of different rights here. Right to sufficient health care, right to rest and leisure. As you can see, what I've bolded for our purposes tonight is the right to property and work, to adequate working conditions, and to a just wage. So this is 1979. This is not Francis saying something at an Angelus last week. This is John Paul speaking in 1979 to the General Assembly of the United Nations. As I said, in the Catholic tradition, rights and responsibilities, or what we might call duties, are always connected. As John the 23rd said in Pacem in Terris, the rights of which we have so far been speaking are inexorably bound up with as many duties. Rights are connected to duties, and it's by virtue of the fact that, again, we are social. We are social, we are connected to one another, we can only realize our dignity and exercise our rights in community. So what does this look like for the tradition? Well, we can talk about different kind of rights. We can talk about negative duties or negative rights, non-violation. You might say, don't tread on me. Don't violate my individual rights, stay away. And that's part of the tradition. But the Catholic tradition takes a more positive approach to this notion of rights and duties. And the claim from the church is that we also have positive duties. That is to say, we have responsibilities to promote others' flourishing. We have a responsibility to help each other, and again, it's because we are sacred, but we are also social. We cannot realize our dignity and our rights absent community. And this, as I said, is at the heart of solidarity, which is, again, one of the principles of Catholic social teaching, but I love, love, love this definition, in part because at least a lot of my students use the term solidarity, but don't actually really get what I don't think what John Paul is saying. So in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, in the 1980s, solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, of the good to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. We are connected. We are sacred, but we are social, and dignity can only be realized in community. That is bedrock to the Catholic Christian way of seeing the world and understanding what it means to be human. So again, let me now pause and find out where you're at with this. Is this, let me by a show of hands, for whom is this new, this notion of rights and duties based on the Catholic vision of people as sacred and social? Is this new for anybody? Okay. You all have taken Catholic social teaching before. It's exciting. What are your thoughts? Rights and duties, is it comfortable, uncomfortable? Yes, sir.
Just a thought about how some people, even in hearing just this much, could react with disdain that I worked and I made my fortune, and somebody else who was less eager than I, less hardworking than I, didn't make it, so why is it my fault?
Right.
Why do I have to help them?
That argument has and continues to be made.
It's a big political thing.
Yes.
In your 7 points here, you say that, not me saying.
Not me, I don't have a tall hat, the bishop's saying.
We have the responsibility to respect the rights of others. And I like what you say about we also have the responsibility to do more than respect, which is to promote and to protect the rights of others.
Right.
So, I mean, that is, respect is nice, but it's a little more passive than promoting and protecting.
Right. And we'll talk more about what that means, kind of practically speaking, when we get to really descend into the particularities about prudential judgments. But yeah, for the time being, rights and responsibilities are bookends of the conversation. Any thoughts? Good. Okay. So Todd used another term that is foundational to Catholic social teaching, this notion of the common good. Hopefully this is old hat for everybody, but classically it is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Let's put that in the parking lot for a minute. I'm going to return to that and unpack that vis-a-vis rights and responsibilities. But just in case you haven't seen this definition before, this is the church's kind of boilerplate understanding of the common good. When we talk about realizing the common good, the church distinguishes two ways of trying to do that. The bishops talk about it as the 2 feet of love in action. Does anybody know what I mean when I say the 2 feet of love in action? Shout it out.
Justice and charity.
Justice and charity, exactly. So these are the two terms that the church uses to talk about the ways in which we protect and promote the common good. So charity is the interpersonal, it's the direct, it's the immediate ministry to people who are in current need. And that is wonderful. That is wonderful, wonderful. That is the corporal works of mercy. That is living the gospel. However, charity must always, in the Catholic tradition, be accompanied by justice. That is to say, attention to systems and structures and policies that occasion people to need charity in the first place. Justice is going upstream and asking, why are people in need? What are the systems? What are the structures? What are the policies? Who are the power players? It's asking more controversial questions, which is why there's a famous quote from a late bishop that says, when I feed people, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're hungry, they call me a communist, because you begin to ask controversial, systemic questions. So we talk about the common good, we talk about individuals, we talk about rights and responsibilities. I'm a visual person, and I think this is a really, really helpful way to begin to unpack this in a rigorous manner that can further ground our conversation about work and the rights of workers. Has anybody read anything or know the name David Hollenbach? Does anybody know that name? One. So David's a Jesuit. He was at Boston College. He was now at Georgetown. In the 1970s and 80s, he was a consultant to the Bishops' Conference, helped write Economic Justice for All. So David is brilliant, and David is brilliant. This is from his book in the early 2000s, The Common Good and Christian Ethics. And what he did was he put it all together in a model by which people can see how all these different pieces work together. So if you'll bear with me for just a minute, what I want to do is give you the framework and then connect this back and have this really be a touchstone for our conversation about work, dignity of workers, and the rights of workers. So this is essentially repackaging Thomas Aquinas, but we can talk about different types of justice. Do people know these? Is this new for people? Okay, so this is new, so I will spend a few minutes on this. So we can talk essentially about 4 types of justice. The first type of justice is commutative justice. This calls for fundamental fairness in all agreements and exchanges between individuals or private social groups. So this is interpersonal, one-on-one, low-level justice, commutative justice. See how I can quote Economic Justice for All to flesh out David's model? David helped write that, which I think is just astounding. So commutative justice, we can talk about distributive justice. Distributive justice requires that the allocation of income, wealth, and power in society be evaluated in light of its effects on persons whose basic material needs are unmet. Distributive justice. So this is the goods of society are made available to individual persons. This is access to the goods of society. We can also talk about contributive justice. This implies that persons have an obligation to be active and productive participants in the life of society, and that society has a duty to enable them to participate in this way. It's a very countercultural way of thinking about justice, that people have a right to be able to promote, to contribute to the common good, and the collective society has a duty to help them live out that right, to exercise their agency. So we have commutative, distributive, contributive. When all of these things are working together, when all systems are firing, we can talk about social justice. Social justice requires an overall institutional framework that will enable people both to participate actively in building up the common good, contributive justice, and to share in the benefits of the common good, distributive justice. The subject of social justice, therefore, is the major institutions that enhance or impede people's participation in creating and benefiting from the common good. So 4 types of justice. The center of it all is social justice, the subject of which are institutions. When I had David in grad school and I saw this, to me, this blew my mind because this put all the pieces together for me. I heard all these different terms, and I'd never seen them put together. So we've got this whole system. The last piece is what happens when people are not able to participate in it. The condition that results when this minimum is not being met can be called marginalization, exclusion from social life and from participation in the common good of the human community. When people are not able to either contribute, derive from, or to be able to execute justice interpersonally between each other. So 4 types of justice, marginalization. Sounded like this was new for most folks. So what do you make of this? What do you make of this model as folks who, by Todd's accounts, are committed to social justice, to living the social mission of the church? What do you make of these different types of justice? Like it? Don't like it? Too academic? What do you think? Yeah.
It'll take some thinking, but
Good.
but I like it because when we don't see social justice, now we can go back and see where the failing is.
Right. Which is what I say to my students. When we talk about social justice, it's too abstract. It's too amorphous. It's too nebulous. It's too hard to pinpoint and break down. Why is it that we can talk about social injustice? This allows us to say, well, it's because people can't contribute, or it's because people don't have access to jobs or housing or healthcare. So we can begin to pinpoint the breakdowns that lead to what we would call social injustice. Other thoughts? Yes.
It's pretty complicated
Okay.
to put into practice
Uh-huh.
as a society,
Right.
or even on a personal level.
Yep. It absolutely does.
And I don't, you could go back deeper and deeper back into why somebody chooses to do this, but I think there are probably people who choose not to participate, period. And it's pretty hard to say, well, this is society's fault.
So we'll talk about this. This is where rights and responsibilities come into play at an individual level and as at a collective level. Because to say that somebody has a right to work also means that they have a responsibility to seek work, to maintain work, to do an honest work, to do an honest day's work. So this is not meant to be one-sided or to eschew any notion of individual responsibility. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that is accounted for in the system. Thoughts? Yeah.
You know, I think for me, when I think about justice, I immediately head toward distributive justice.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the one that I think I can see that things are not distributed real well in some instances.
Right.
It dignifies in our country and around the world. So I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about these other areas of justice, because that's the one that I get all riled up about.
Absolutely, and I understand that. I'm also glad that you're thinking. Okay, so we've sketched things out. So now I hope you've been willing to stay with me, or that you have seen it as worthwhile. Because now what I want to do is pivot and begin to talk about this notion of work, the dignity of work, and the rights of workers. To do that, I'm going to heavily reference an encyclical written in 1981, Laborem Exertions, Through Work, written written by John Paul, St. John Paul. Have folks are familiar with this document? Yes? No? Okay. Just trying to get a sense of where people are at with all of this. So in 1981, John Paul wrote a document called Through Work that was arguably the church's most thoughtful reflection, in many ways is still to date the most thoughtful reflection on this topic of human work and the rights of workers. And so what he did at the beginning was to talk about the dignity of work. Why is it that we say that work has dignity or we can realize dignity in work? Where does this come from? Well, he begins the conversation by talking about the fact that work is constitutive of human life. Contrary to some popular theology, work is part of God's plan. So remember the mandate, be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the earth, fish of the sea, birds of the air, all living things that crawl on the earth. This is before the fall. This was part of God's plan for human persons, is that, again, we would be co-creators with God. We would be laborers in God's vineyard. So work is constitutive of human life. I'll pass over the misapplication of that and just emphasize that this is not meant to be carte blanche for environmental degradation. This is, I think, better understood in the mandate to cultivate and care for creation. But however you want to understand it, work is part of God's plan for human persons as individuals and together. So this is, again, I'm trying to unpack all of this because I think it's too easy to just rush right into particular policies. I want to unpack John Paul's thinking, and it's fairly nuanced, but I think it's to our advantage. So in the early parts of the encyclical, he talks about and he identifies two dimensions of human work. One he calls the objective, and the other he calls the subjective. And I'll just read, so from the Compendium of the Social Act of the Church, which essentially condenses the church's thinking on particular topics, and Laborum Exertions is central to the church's reflection on this topic in particular. So in the objective sense, we mean the sum of activities, resources, instruments, and technologies used by men and women to produce things and to perform tasks. The objective is the work performed, the objective work performed, the tools that are used to implement it, the product that's produced. Those are the objective dimensions of work. With me so far? Okay. That is valid, that is important, but that is not the most important part of work, at least according to the church. What's more important is the subjective sense, by which we mean work as the activity of the human person as a dynamic being capable of performing a variety of actions that are part of the work process and that correspond to a personal vocation. We can maybe talk about the subjective as accounting for the fact that the human person is the subject of the work. And it's more important to think about what the work does to a human person and whether or not it upholds that person's inviolable dignity and fundamental human rights than it is to focus on the objective nature of the work. That person is a mechanic, that person is a teacher. That's important, but not as important as the questions, what does that work do to or for that person's dignity? Does it uphold their dignity? Does it violate their dignity? Do the conditions of their work, are the conditions or the pay consistent with the person's dignity? When we talk about the subjective, we're talking about the human person as the subject of the conversation. Does that distinction make sense? Okay. For John Paul, the sources of the dignity of work are to be sought primarily in the subjective dimension, not in the objective one. It's less important, again, what somebody does as a profession, as a form of work, than it is what that work does to a person and whether or not it's consistent with and upholds that person's inviolable dignity, the subjective dimension of work. So to put it in different terms, maybe a little bit more accessible, we can talk about the value of work as the degree to which it promotes human dignity and community, rooted in a vocation to be co-creators with God. Work is valuable to the extent that it upholds human dignity, not necessarily in the extent to which it produces something for society, or that it provides a service. good or bad. Ultimately, it's about what it does to human persons. And in this is actually consistent, going back to the Bishop's document, Economic Justice for All. The dignity of the human person, realized in community with others, is the criterion against which all aspects of economic life must be measured. So at the end of the day, it's about human dignity. Work is about upholding, protecting, and promoting human dignity, the subjective dimension of human labor. So there's a lot there. Let me pause and just ask, is that clear? Are there clarifying questions? What do you think of all of this? Like, don't like, uncomfortable, confused?
Are there guidelines for judging?
This is where I'm sympathetic to the desire to rush into particularities. There are, to the extent that we keep in mind what it means to be human, that a person's dignity and what that person's dignity requires, namely the protection of particular rights. So we can begin to put these things together and say, work upholds the subjective dimension, or there is a subjective dimension of work to the extent that rights are protected, that people have a right to a just wage, that people have a right to safe working conditions, that they have a right to leisure. To the extent that those rights are protected, then we can say the subjective dimension of work is being upheld and is being celebrated as a way of expressing human dignity. Does that make sense? This is one of the criticisms of Catholic social teaching, is that it's very reluctant to descend into the nitty-gritty because of this notion of prudential judgment. So it calls on people to form their consciences and apply these principles to particular situations.
Well, in some cultures, something like taking a janitorial position and cleaning toilets is not considered dignified. And, and yet, I suppose in some ways, there's a way to think about that in terms of it being a subjective good. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's...
I just, cleaning toilets is one of my least favorite things.
I understand that, and I think part of it is recognizing work as a way to contribute to society, work as co-creating a society with God in which other rights are protected and defended. So it's, in a sense, it's how you look at it, because objectively, you can make a judgment, but what John Paul is saying is the objective dimension isn't really what it's about. It's the subjective dimension. And does this work? Is that janitor paid a living wage? Does that janitor have hazardous or non-hazardous cleaning materials? Those are the questions that John Paul is more concerned about in terms of putting human dignity at the front and center of the conversation. Helpful?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Other thoughts? I mean, this is complicated. This is not straightforward. Yes.
I can think of other jobs, certain jobs in the financial industry or in the justice industry, like people who are responsible for sending people to prison. I can see how in some ways those can be problematic for people, like punishment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So everything is kind of thrown into the mix.
It is thrown into the mix, and this is where it folds into an area of ethics called virtue ethics, which attends to people's characters and dispositions, and we can ask questions about whether work builds character, whether it tears down character. So all these layers of Christian ethics start to come together. But you're exactly right, and those are the questions, not the messiness of trying to apply all of this and make prudential judgments that this job is or is not one that is worth pursuing or is affirmed as something that's life-giving for the community.
Work, to me, when you're speaking, I think I started working in a family grocery store in the 4th grade. I don't think anybody was thinking about my human dignity at that point. In the sense of, it was part of what you did as part of a family, and all the way through, every sibling I had, we all worked in the grocery store. So I understand where we're going with this in a broad sense, but when I think about work, I have a very different conception of work from my own viewpoint.
Right. Yeah. very valid. Does this model, can they be reconciled? Can you somehow overlay this model onto your experience, or are they really at odds to the point that this is just not applicable?
No, because if you think about contributing to the community, obviously my point of that was the community of the family. We were very much contributing to that, and then to the small area that we lived in. So yes, I can see how it overlays, but I think to me it's developmental. You know, I started as a child and I worked through the adult, and I think it changed over time how I saw work.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
And, I mean, the thought occurs to me as technology evolves and the increased use of robotics and mechanization, to me that takes away a person's right to work. I mean, that's more my concern with that technology increasing.
Right, and this is where you get into the particulars of prudential judgments about specific technology, specific policies, specific sectors. You know, a job that is, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, but a job that is mechanized and displaces workers creates unemployment and violates the right to work. In that case, and we'll get to this in just a minute or two, society has a responsibility to be able to facilitate a transition whereby those displaced persons are able to find meaningful, sustaining work, which is why the church has been so critical of neoliberal capitalism that would chew up workers who are displaced by mechanization and sees no responsibility whatsoever to help them retrain, reintegrate, re-enter. So this is the nitty-gritty of all this. I mean, I'll give you a very concrete example from my lifestyle work, as I said, on climate change. You know, West Virginia's coal country is, I mean, the employment numbers have declined over the last 30 years because of mechanization. So you've got displaced coal workers, and you've got a push to move away from fossil fuels generally. So you've got an entirely displaced community that was fossil fuel dependent. That is why the U.S. bishops have advocated for what we're calling transitional justice. This was the Obama administration's Power Plus plan to provide resources to communities that had lost jobs to mechanization and that had lost jobs to a transition away from the carbon economy. And so this was one attempt to realize this responsibility to help persons realize their right to work consistent with their dignity. Make sense? Again, this is where, you know, I can stand up here and talk plainly about how, you know, principles and ideas and models, but it gets very messy very quickly when you start to begin to apply all these things and make those prudential judgments that Tom mentioned. Okay, so we've framed the conversation in terms of the human person, in terms of rights and responsibilities and Catholic social teaching. So now I think we can really begin to have this conversation about the specific topic, and then making specific judgments about different conditions. So based on everything that we've said, Laborum Exertions, LE, John Paul affirms and recognizes a fundamental right to work. This is constitutive of the Catholic tradition, and for all the reasons that we've said, that it's work is the means by which we realize our dignity as co-creators with God. So there is a right to work. Rights are those things that ensure, protect, and promote human dignity. And so we can also talk about rights that help protect human dignity within the context of work. So we can talk about, and the church does talk about, a right to safe working conditions. The church talks about a right to rest, right, or leisure, recognizing the fact that persons are multidimensional, that we're engaged in a number of different relationships, that we're not just automated machines that are one-dimensional agents of productivity. At the same time, and this is where I'm circling back to the concern raised about responsibilities, again, rights and responsibilities always come together. So to the extent that we talk about an individual right to work, we also talk about individual responsibilities. So again, we can talk about the responsibility that people have an obligation to to get an education, to go out, to make the best of the opportunities that they have available to them, to do the best they can with what they've got. So this right to work doesn't in any way eschew an obligation to try and realize that right to the best of their ability, to put in an honest day's work, to produce honest products that help society and don't harm society, so there are all kinds of responsibilities on the individual. At the same time, and again, this is where the church is countercultural, prophetic, and arguably controversial, there is a collective responsibility with respect to work. This involves the state, and this is where people get uncomfortable. In the Catholic tradition, the state is a natural good, by virtue of the fact that human flourishing requires order. Chaos is not conducive to human flourishing. To any one of your examples, any one of your experiences in your own life, at some point, there's got to be some kind of governing structure within which human persons engage in relationships, have disagreements, have sometimes incommensurable conflicts about values and judgments. The whole reason for the state, this is John 23rd of Mater Magistra, the whole reason for the state, its whole raison d'etre, is the realization of the common good, of which order is part. So the whole reason the state exists is to protect and promote the common good. That is the whole reason the state exists. It's raison d'etre. This is not to say that the church advocates for big government. This is not to say that the church wants a nanny state. This is to say that the church recognizes that the state has a legitimate role to play in society's pursuit of the common good. The principle that adjudicates, again, this is theory, this is not praxis, but this is theory. The principle that adjudicates whether or not government should intervene is this principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, going back to Pius IX, Quadragesimo Anno, subsidiarity calls society to protect and promote the common good with the lowest possible but highest necessary level of state intervention. Lowest possible but highest necessary. So to the extent that voluntary organizations, to the extent that individuals working in community, to the extent that those levels of society are able to protect and promote the common good and ensure the rights of all persons, leave it to them. But to the extent that they're not able to, the state has a legitimate role to intervene and ensure that whatever rights are being violated are in fact protected and promoted. So the state has a legitimate role to play. Why do I say all of this? With respect to a responsibility around work, and I'm going to read this full thing because this is important for our conversation, at least I think it is, grounded in church teaching. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church talks and says, with respect to responsibilities to work, the state, whose duty it is to promote active employment policies, that is, policies that will encourage the creation of employment opportunities within the national territory, providing the production sector with incentives to this end. The duty of the state does not consist so much in directly guaranteeing the right to work of every citizen, making the whole of economic life very rigid and restricting individual free initiative, as much as in the duty to sustain business activities by creating conditions which will ensure job opportunities by stimulating those activities where they are lacking, or by supporting them in moments of crisis. In other words, the church says it is not the state's role to ensure that every person has a job and that everybody has a federal job working for the government. It is to say that the state has a legitimate concern and a legitimate responsibility in ensuring people's right to work in situations where lesser entities in society are not able to guarantee that right. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Again, this is theory. This is theory. This is not in any way at the level of particulars of one policy proposal or another, but it is to say that in the eyes of the church, the state has a legitimate role to play in ensuring the right of persons to work. That is not an uncontroversial statement. So let me pause and find out what is your reaction to that. First, are there clarifying questions? And second of all, what is your reaction to that?
I'll give you questions.
The one right before it?
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go. Got a couple questions.
Sure.
Can you give some examples? I mean, could this be like, a big infrastructure program when lots of people are?
This would be the New Deal.
This would be the New Deal, okay.
This would be the New Deal. Which again, isn't to say that the particulars of the New Deal were baptized by the church. Because people of faith and goodwill can disagree about the particularities of this policy or that policy. Should the New Deal go out and build this bridge? Should it go out and revitalize this area of town? Those are that's the messiness and the nitty gritty of how all this gets played out. But it is to say that the New Deal is an example of how society tried to realize this ideal of stepping in and working to ensure the right to work when lesser entities were unable to do that. Yeah, so the New Deal would kind of be the classic example.
What
Yes.
about things like the Fed chair and manipulating interest rates and things like that? Would that also be?
That is a very complicated question that gets into questions about what is the purpose of manipulating the interest rate, for whom, to what end, serving what agenda, making who great or not great. Those are all the questions that get rolled into that. So in theory, I guess, if the end was to manipulate interest rates in order to expand employment in society, then that could be seen as a way in which the state is trying to fulfill its responsibility to ensure the right of work of its citizens. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Of course, whatever is done is usually done as a political move to gain votes.
I'm sorry, say again.
A political move to gain votes, more so than, look how I'm following the precepts of the bishops. I'm doing the right thing here.
Well, and this gets to questions about what is the role of faith in public life, what is the responsibility of elected officials. So I would argue that it's the responsibility of persons of faith to bring this into the public square and advocate for elected officials to govern according to these principles. Whether or not they are or not is an entirely different question.
So I think there was a recent article about the state of Nebraska has been pretty successful in increasing minimum wage jobs, but not necessarily higher paid jobs. And, what they might do about that. Like,
What was the last question?
and what would the state, what will the state do to
Right.
maybe try and increase higher paid?
Well, that gets into the question of a just wage. Again, at the level of theory, this is in no way descending into the particularities, but it's at the level of theory based on the claims that people are sacred and social and that dignity can only be realized in community. For the church, there is a right to a wage that ensures the protection and promotion of human dignity for the worker and for her or his dependents. That is the claim of the church. That is not to say that the church is in the business of establishing the dollars and cents of the minimum wage, but it is to say that given the vision of the human person, that everybody has dignity, and that the family is the fundamental unit of society in which dependents rely on the protection and provision of usually parents, that wages are such that the dignity of both workers and dependents is maintained. So when you talk about minimum wage jobs, when you talk about anything that has to do with wage, again, I'm staying at the level of principles, but this is the vision, these are the ideals according to which the conversation should be guided. And I'm not familiar with Nebraska's, the particularities around Nebraska's minimum wage legislation, but again, in the eyes of the church, these are the ethical coordinates of the compensation. Human dignity of both the worker and of dependents. I want to make one clarifying remark about just wage, living wage. I guess I will read this because it is important. So this is from arguably the beginning of Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII. In 1891 said, let the working person and the employer make free agreements, and in particular, let them agree freely as to the wages. So people are free to engage in commutative justice. Remember, justice one-on-one, interpersonal level. Nevertheless, there underlies a dictate of natural justice more imperious and ancient than any bargain between persons, namely, that wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. If through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the working person accept harder conditions because of an employer or contractor will afford him no better, that person is made the victim of force and injustice. In other words, people who are forced to work, people who willingly or voluntarily enter into agreements that entail less than a just wage, on paper it may look like justice because they have freely entered into it, but according to the dictates of natural justice that's underpinned, that is sustained on human dignity, that is an unjust, unjust condition. So just because a worker has entered into a contract or has agreed to do work for a particular wage doesn't necessarily mean that that is a just wage. Again, the compendium, the simple agreement between employee and employer with regard to the amount of pay to be received is not sufficient for the agreed upon salary to qualify as a just wage, because a just wage must not be below the level of subsistence of the worker. Natural justice precedes and is above the freedom of the contract, putting it in slightly clearer, more succinct terms. And again, this gets back to the state. It's the responsibility of the state to ensure a just wage according to subsidiarity. So again, to the extent that lesser entities in society are able to afford workers a living just wage, let them do it. But to the extent that people are not afforded a just wage, the state has a responsibility to step in and protect and promote human dignity by which, or with which, a living wage ensures its protection and promotion. Make sense? Okay. Let's collapse these last two in the interest of time. The third dimension of this, and we could talk all night about all this, but the third piece of this that I do just want to raise has to do with rights and responsibilities regarding labor unions. So as we've said, humans are both sacred and social. As I've said, innate dignity and inviolable rights can only be fully realized in community. So again, those are the terms of the conversation. Based on these claims, again, this is John Paul and Laborum Exertions, 1981, the right of association, that is, to form associations for the purpose of defending the vital interests of those employed in various professions. These associations are called labor or trade unions. They are indeed a mouthpiece for the struggle for social justice, for the just rights of working people in accordance with their individual professions. The church has consistently, really since 1891, Rerum Novarum, affirmed the right of workers to organize, affirmed the right of workers to unionize, based again on these claims that people are sacred and social, and that there's a right to association that extends into the workplace. So labor unions within the tradition of the Catholic Church, again, that's why I did the whole theological anthropology at the beginning. Based on those claims, the church affirms the legitimacy of unions. Rights and responsibilities, though. Unions have the duty of acting as representatives, working for the proper arrangement of economic life, and educating the social consciences of workers for the common good. Unions and other forms of labor associations are to work in cooperation with other social entities and are to take an interest in the management of public matters. Union organizations have the duty to exercise influence in the political arena, making it duly sensitive to labor problems and helping it to work so that workers' rights are respected. So, right to organize, responsibility to be a goodwill participant in the fabric of social life, rights and responsibilities. So let me stop and again ask questions, feedback, pushback, either on the notion of just wage, living wage, or on labor unions. Again, not uncontroversial.
Does the church have a position on union busing? I mean, do they speak out to the bishop? I don't know, I just don't know that much about that.
Yeah, this, again, it gets into the particularities of a specific situation. Is a particular union fulfilling its duties and responsibilities to society? If not, then the attempt to break up that union might not be a problematic thing. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah. Again, at the level of principles, unions are a legitimate, valid, important entity within society. But there could be situations in which they are not fulfilling their duties and responsibilities. And that's as much as I can say at the level of principles. Other questions, thoughts, concerns, pushbacks? Just wage, living wage? Yes.
When Rerum Novarum was written, it was 40 years before we had any sort of minimum wage, before there was a 40-hour work week. Children could still be coerced to work by family, not necessarily in a family business either, but someplace else. There was not a responsibility for them to be in school. And as we look at the Catholic teaching of the time, I'm just thinking that it probably had a great impact on getting some of these wrongs righted and getting unions started to negotiate better conditions for our workers, our grandparents. I mean, I remember when my dad got out of home from World War II and made 80 cents an hour.
I would say yes, but. I would say yes, it created the conditions in which the teaching could be used, but having the teaching doesn't necessarily mean that it's applied. And I would argue that it's the responsibility of the laity to go out and actually apply, unpack, demand that the teaching be respected, promoted, adhered to. So I would say that the teaching broke the ground, but it has been the responsibility of Catholic labor movements and people of good faith and goodwill collaborating in the public square and bringing these teachings into particular situations. So having the teaching isn't enough, I would say.
On the right to unionize, has the Catholic Church been an exemplar of recognizing unions such as Catholic teachers in schools, or claiming exemptions from laws that allow teaching assistants who attempt to unionize at Catholic University and attempt to say, well, we're not subject by the general rules?
Yeah, you're asking very, very thoughtful, very, how to be diplomatic. Very controversial question, because there are Catholic entities who have attempted to union bust Catholic workers attempting to unionize, sometimes with reference to religious freedom and exemption from laws that would otherwise afford employees of Catholic institutions to unionize. So there is an ongoing tension in the United States anyway, in which there is an irony, I guess, to say the least, about this teaching and the way it's lived out over time. How's that for diplomatic? Remember, I don't have tenure.
Question.
Yep.
One of the things that you pointed out repeatedly is that there are principles, and as you descend into the particulars, morality gets so complex in a way that there are all sorts of different perspectives. And I think one of the points raised earlier is that we're not hearing about Catholic social teaching that much from the pulpit or even from the bishops that much. I mean, do you think, I wish the bishops would speak out more forcefully sometimes about a just wage, about universal health care, about food insecurity. Do you think there are other reasons that the bishops aren't more forceful about social justice issues, but they are very forceful about other issues, same-sex marriage, abortion, those types of things?
That's an interesting question. I think it's interesting to me because I work at the national level that I'm how to be diplomatic. On the bishop's website, on the USCCB website, if you go to the tab Human Life and Dignity and drop down and you get all the different issues, it's amazing to see the number of issues in which the bishops have been involved at the level of prudential judgment. So in my experience, it's not that the bishops' conference itself isn't engaged in these issues. That, again, I work on climate change. We filed an amicus brief in DC Circuit Court in support of the Clean Power Plan. We've submitted testimony at public hearings at the EPA around mercury and toxins and things like that. So, but I think it is true that somehow that hasn't descended from the conference to dioceses to parishes. And so in terms of a breakdown and a disconnect, that isn't to say that at the same time there are a list of priorities that could be criticized coming from the top. But it is to say that I think there's a responsibility on all of our parts to be aware of what's coming from the bishops and to actively try and implement it into adult faith formation, into catechesis, bring it into the public square in terms of, public pulse and letters to the editor and the Catholic Voice and all those things. So I'm trying to dance around what you're asking, because I know what you're asking. But I do think there is a responsibility on all of us.
I think, just as a follow-up comment, I think there's an ecclesiology behind it as well, and there needs to be the ability, the church needs to embrace subsidiarity as part of its own institutional reality, participatory justice that allows for the lay people and their voice. And I think Pope Francis is really promoting that.
Right.
And I think it's a matter of trickle down, and I think it's working, but it's a slow process.
Right, and it's a sense of feeling empowered of first of all, education, like you said, this not being the church's best kept secret, but of people actually recognizing a social ethic that comes from the foundational claim that God is love, and that means something in how we live and what we buy and the choices that we make. Once that awareness is there, then I think we can begin to have more substantive conversations, but I think, at least in my experience, that is a revelation that a lot of people haven't recognized. Other closing thoughts? Other agree, disagree, pushback? Like I said, I've been called a lot of things.
I just have a quick question. This is about like distribution, again, distributive justice. Oh, thank you. Do you feel that there's ever a situation where some people can have too much money?
That is a good question. There is, the church has, so a couple of things. The church has affirmed a floor beneath which no person should fall, namely a floor that violates their dignity. The church affirms the principle of equality, whereby persons are the same at the top of an organization and at the bottom. And it seems like, and this is again as specific as the church has been willing to get in a lot of ways, it would seem that in a world of finite resources, a ceiling above which people should not rise is almost built into the teaching. That somehow there is an implicit ceiling that is consistent with a floor that would protect everybody's dignity. Make sense? Yes. Oh. One other hand.
Patty Hager.
Last word.
Do any other faith traditions have a developed social teaching like the Catholic faith tradition?
Well, that's a good question. So I am not a comparative theologian. I would say yes, without being able to point directly to one denomination or another. But in all of my workings in Catholic social teaching, I've encountered elements of traditions that are rich and developed and congruent with the Catholic vision of a particular issue or society or things like that. So absolutely, I would say.
This is a little bit off topic.
Yep.
I think I just put it on. I'm winding into another direction here. Mike Poulin donated several books here to the library, and this is the crowd that might like them. If you would like to take any of these and read them and bring them back to the library or keep them in circulation in your own circles, that is fine. These were either duplicates or things that he didn't need anymore. But I think it's very much in tune with what we're talking about tonight. So help yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Todd.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan, for a very clear and excellent presentation. It's very helpful for us to think about Catholic social teaching and to spread the word, I think. So thank you very much.
Hopefully you've gotten some helpful things to think about, some new ideas, different ways of seeing old insights, old material, old principles. So thank you for having me.
So can we audit classes?
you can ask my dean. I would not have a problem with it.
Thank you again.
Thank you.